And now we have about 20 minutes. If you agree, we'll take some questions. We'll take 3 questions together and then ask the panel to respond. Questions, please? Yes, please.
So my question is to Mr. Nabil. You said that the nation states are declining and they probably would be replaced by some other body, if I have heard you correctly.
Not quite. They would not be replaced.
I mean, you will find more stakeholders in the process.
More stakeholders. Yeah. So with the growing nationalist right-wing movement all across the world, do you think they would accept the decline of the nation state, or to allow more actors to come in the game?
You want them together?
Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah. Short question, please. Yeah, I'll come to you.
Excellency, our Indian strength is human resources, manpower, which is a youth. Don't you think that this, our youth, can contribute a lot, strengthening relationship between Egypt or Nigeria with our technical power and human resources, the way they contributed in USA? Now, recently, Trump administration is not comfortable with these foreigners. So, this youth power can be also a great utility for these both countries.
Okay. Somebody at the back there. Yes, please.
Nilanjan Gupta. I disagree with you, Mr. Saran, when you say that non-alignment is unimportant and irrelevant in today's world. Because
I didn't say that.
Well, like it's a bad
I
word.
said that was the discourse in the
Right,
country. Yes.
right.
I don't agree with it. Yeah.
Okay. In fact, I disagree and think it's more important than ever in today's world in the light of Nehru and Nasser's achievements. Secondly, I want to know from you, sir, why Boko Haram has not yet been countered in Nigeria. And the third is the last comment, that I think there are more commonalities with China than differences. What would you have to say?
Between China
and India.
India, okay. Excellency, would you like to...
Yeah, well, what was the last question? I didn't quite get it. The last comment about India and
Boko
China.
Haram.
No, okay.
Why?
Okay, well, yeah. No, I got that. Yeah, I got that.
Secondly, with respect to China, I will answer that.
Yes, exactly. So for Boko Haram, it started as a local insurrection and really local discontent with governance. That's how it started. It was very poorly handled because, again, military response to non-military threats. And so what began as a local insurrection, very poorly handled, and not addressing some of the root causes of discontent in the area. Unemployment. Boko Haram literally means Western education is useless, so it's haram. It's because the attitude is that you go to school and then in the end, no employment. So what is the value? So the area in which Boko Haram operates is some of the poorest parts of Nigeria. So that inequality, which is a global phenomenon, but inequality in Nigeria is also between different parts of the country. So the poorest part, where the feeling of alienation, feeling of exclusion, these were never really properly handled, and the military response turned out to be inadequate. Now, to make matters worse, now you had a proliferation of small arms and light weapons following the collapse of Libya. A lot of arms were being trafficked southward. So the Sahel became a problem all the way to Boko Haram. The means of livelihood with the drying up of Lake Chad, which used to provide a lot of employment for the people, was also an issue. Now the alignment. So now you have Sahel Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda Al-Qaeda, and ISS. All of them now find, because they look for areas, the soft underbelly, if you can use the word. And those alignment has now complicated very much the Boko Haram menace. Now, the president of Nigeria has said, and very rightly, that the military capability of Boko Haram has been decimated. Fine. And they are pushed, there's a time they used to control large territory. They've been pushed back. But unless you address the root causes, the fundamental reason why people, Nigerians, fun-loving people, never thought we'll ever have suicide bombers. This was un-African, but then you had them. So you have to address those alienation, exclusion, hopelessness, unemployment, poor governance, before you can actually defeat Boko Haram, because you can defeat them militarily and push them back. But if you don't address those issues, you cannot ultimately defeat Boko Haram.
Youth,
Sure. There's two questions about youth and nationalism. I think it's important to take into account that large sectors of our populations worldwide are uncomfortable with how the elite is governing. They feel marginal. That exists in America, in the richest country in the world, and it exists in other parts of the world. Globalization has also sort of made the challenges much more closer to home. Then it's not only about taking advantage of low production costs in Asia or in Africa in a market, but you also take advantage and also suffer the consequences if these people don't benefit from the work they are doing. So there is a rejection of how governments are managing, or I mean, that's not the right word. There is a lack of comfort with how governments are managing their day-to-day affairs, and we all need to look at that a bit more carefully. On the issue of youth, there's no question. Youth is a tremendous resource, but it's also a powder keg. If you look at the Arab world, 65% of the population is 30 years or younger. A recent UN Human Development Report about the youth in the Arab world said that there is extremely high unemployment for educated youth, much more than the uneducated youth. However, it also concluded that in spite of that, we see no serious trend towards extremism among the youth. In other words, if job opportunities are made available to them, if the future is difficult, but at least is better, youth is a tremendous asset. And I think the workforce, of an educated workforce, is useful, but you need to create opportunity for them.
yeah. You know, the question about India and China. Yes, of course, there are many similarities between India and China. But I think at the end of the day, we need to recognize that these are two very different civilizations. Their civilizational heritage is different. The way in which China looks at the world and sees its own place in the world is very different from the way India looks at the world and sees its own place in the world. So there are areas where, of course, we need to be able to work together, and we do. For example, when I was doing climate change negotiations, perhaps the closest ally that we had in those negotiations were the Chinese. Or if you look at, say, World Trade Organization and the negotiations there on the multilateral trading order, there are many issues on which India and China actually work very closely together. So it's not that it's an either-or kind of situation. There are areas where you can work together. There are areas, I'm afraid, we need to confront each other. You know, that's a part of the game. But I would say, on balance, I believe that going forward, unless leadership in both countries make big mistakes, I think what we have been able to achieve so far, and I think Mr. Menon made a reference to this in the that what is very remarkable is that despite the kind of differences we have, despite the border issue between the two countries, the border has remained essentially very peaceful and tranquil over the last so many decades. And that's something to be celebrated. There are provocations from the Chinese side, there are incidents on the border, but even when there has been confrontation, no shot has been fired in anger so far. Hopefully, this will this will remain the case. Economic opportunities are enormous. Today, even in China, they say that if we are looking, especially with this trade war with the United States, if we are looking at which is the country which can really provide, a market for China. And the example given of, say, Xiaomi or Oppo or what Alibaba has been able to achieve here, these are very large investments. These are making a bet on the Indian economy, which suggests a different mindset from what we see on the security or the political side. And so the economic opportunities are certainly multiplying, and if there is a willingness to to try and take advantage of them, there will be security issues like we are having with Huawei, and those are serious issues. I don't think we should put them aside. Those are serious issues which will need to be. But there are many other areas where you don't have those security issues, and you can actually take the relationship forward. Yeah. Okay. Next round, which will be the last round, I think. Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
No, you haven't answered my question.
About?
Non-alignment.
Yeah. What was your question?
I said, don't you think it's more relevant than ever in today's unipolar world?
Well, I think that was precisely what we were all saying, that, despite the fact that today non-alignment is being dismissed as something which was irrelevant and perhaps it was a failed experiment, certainly the view amongst the three of us is that during that historical period, the non-aligned movement actually played a very, very important role. When the world was really locked into a confrontation, a very dangerous confrontation, by the way, between. So today, unless the countries which form part of the non-aligned movement, unless they have a certain commitment to it, unless they see that yes, even in this new world, we have an important role to play, that will not happen. That particular perception is not there. So unless that perception comes back, unless there is a kind of a revival of that spirit and solidarity amongst countries, and in fact the more important countries will have to play a very critical role in that respect. That is where leadership comes in. Okay, last round, please. And very short questions because we are running out of time. Yes, please.
Sir, in this brilliant session, one message that we got very loud and clear was there is a global challenge of visionary leadership. Sir. In the context of navigating India's 21st century transition, I think majority would believe that India today at least has a leader that is very visionary, especially with respect to engaging on the international stage. How do you explain this contradiction?
Well, I think engagement is one thing. How you put forward a vision of the world which persuades others. It's not enough that I have a certain vision about India and about India's role. You also need to be able to persuade others that yes, this is a vision that they can also buy into. I think in that respect, because of the pressure of circumstances, I think a lot of Indian diplomacy today, whether we like it or not, has become very transactional. That is, we look at where are we able to take some benefit out of something? Where do we avoid some problem for ourselves by making certain adjustments? So it is very much a foreign policy of here and now. We are, even though the rhetoric may be that we are looking at the long term, but that's not what we are doing in reality. So I think certainly there is no doubt that Prime Minister Modi has proved to be a very active leader in terms of engagement with the rest of the world. He has certainly been someone who is recognized, widely across the world stage. His relationships with major leaders are very, very, very important. But I think we need something a little more than just that in order to really have the kind of role that you are looking at. Yes, please.
Sir, I have heard there are many beautiful hearts in Africa.
Many.
And in India also the beautiful hearts. Can you not have an exchange of knowledge to have these alternate medications and all that? Herbs,
All right, okay. One more question. Yeah.
So, across the world, we talk of population being a resource. But the exponential increase in the population, isn't it a bigger challenge with the amount of resources? And ultimately, the larger the population you have, the more resources you want, the more control you want to take. Which is why we expand ourselves and create.
Okay, is population a challenge or is it something which we can be used as a resource? Yes, please, just a very, very last question. I think we are completely out of time.
It's not a question.
Yeah.
I'd just like to compliment this panel for having moved us beyond Westphalia and the zero-sum game security discourse to one of the possibilities of an alternative vision. Really like to thank this panel on behalf of all of us. But I have one or two questions. While you foregrounded dialogue and diversity, my question was that how do we bring about a kind of normative pressure on this huge issue of people on the run, people on the move, the nowhere people, where statelessness and displacement is dotting the global landscape?
Yeah.
And finally, whether we use soft power, hard power, or smart power, how are we going to, do you feel, for example, that the SDGs do provide us a kind of template for a collaborative language of action beyond merely the mandate of governments? Or do you think that because it comes from the UN, it's already sanitized and anesthetic? Thank you very much.
Okay, so last comment.
Very briefly, SDGs are very important, but that's also a definition, an illustration of collective definition. It wasn't the UN, but it's the member states reacting to pressures from their own domestic concern. And I can say, at least for the African Union, the SDG has been internalized and put as part of its own vision of what they call, because SDGs are often called Agenda 2030. Agenda 2063, when the Organization of African Unity was first formed, about 100 years from that time, and it's about a peaceful, prosperous, and inclusive Africa, where the guns will be silenced, and Africa will not be defined by crisis and conflict, but the opportunity for prosperity. And last point I'd like to make about the youth and about the population. Africa is the most youthful continent. And I believe that in terms of the proportion of people under 20, that the future of Africa literally depends on how we motivate, how we empower the youth and the women, because they are two biggest resources for the African continent. And it's not just about giving youth employment, but also making them employers, entrepreneurship, but regarding them as the true human capital that can move the continent towards the realization of not only agenda, the SDGs, but also the African Union's own agenda of 2063. Thank you.
Something about migration, which is an important issue.
Sure. Well, first, before migration, on the issue of population and youth, the worst case scenario is increased population with no jobs. Yeah. So you're eating up resources and you don't create opportunity, and consequently, it's a losing situation. I would argue for managed population growth. That being said, youth presently, our resources are not used properly, so we should take advantage of that as we deal with the larger problem. The issue of migration, it's a function in many respects of the pull and push factors of globalization, and the push and pull factors in each of our countries or in other countries, where people don't want to live or can't live well. They will be attracted to more acceptable places to live in. At the same time, I think the developed world tends to ignore the fact that a lot of its progress was a function of brain migration from the developing world to their part of it. They had the better systems, but they also took advantage of migration in a positive sense. So I look at the migration issue like I look at, frankly, the terrorism issue. These aren't issues that will be dealt with only domestically or only internationally. They have to both be dealt with from both sides of the story. At the same time, it's not going to be an economic issue alone. It's not going to be a security issue alone. And we will ultimately all suffer from that. Let me give you a specific example. The richest country in the world, America. What is the big bombastic issue being discussed and which today will cause a partial shutdown of the government? That the Congress will not give the president $500 million is something of that effect to build a wall against migrants, even though America is an immigrant society.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, this is not, and why are they coming there? Because they can't find a acceptable quality of life in their own country. These issues can't be dealt with separately. That's why I keep arguing over and over again. We all deal with our immediate problems on a day-to-day basis, and we will continue to do so. But unless we look the day after, the consequences will not be what we want.
But also, isn't there a very real deficit of empathy?
Sure.
You know, I think we are becoming very sort of inured to the kind of violence that we see, the kind of suffering that we see. You know, it doesn't seem to you know, tackle our sensitivities as perhaps in
You're making
the
an
past.
excellent point, and I don't want to take too much time, but when I was ambassador in Washington, I was invited to one of those really big events with very high-profile people in Aspen, Colorado. And I went there. This was back in 2000. And they were all WASPs. So as a new ambassador, I wanted to make a name for myself. So I put up my hand. And I said, I noticed I'm the only colored person in the room. This wasn't a room. This was a stadium, and a big open auditorium. And you hear the silence. These were all billionaires and above, nobody below that. And my only goal was to make sure they knew that the ambassador had come here. I did not have an argument with anyone. But they were living in La La Land, as if the rest of the world, at the same time, the U.S. government, and I'm not anti-American at all, was objecting to Mali producing cotton. Now, does really the cotton in Mali affect the American market share of cotton? And I had no interest in this, by the way, except being African. And we also produce our own cotton. But I went to the State Department and I said, guys, you're really picking on Mali? So you have to have empathy and you have to understand.
Okay, on that note, I think we have to call this to a conclusion. And it remains for me to thank our two very distinguished panelists for being so patient with us, answering all our questions. And wonderful audience, thank you also very much for actively participating in this session. And many, many thanks to Yamini and CPR for giving us this opportunity, which is, I think, a rather rare one. Thank you.
And thanks to our moderator.
Thank you for we couldn't have asked for a better way to close these 2 days of dialogues. You've given us a lot of hope and vision and new ideas, and I hope that we can continue these conversations amongst ourselves and have a much broader set of conversations with friendly developing countries, because I do think the future lies in precisely this. And I particularly wanted to endorse, Excellency, your comment about think tank to think tank interactions, and I hope that we have the opportunity for many more. Thank you everyone for being here, and I'd like to invite all of you for dinner as we close tonight. Thanks.